Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Hey boys, what's up? Cool. Hey, so it's been a while. I'm continuing. Chapter 4. I've watched chapters 1, 2, and 3 a bit long ago, but I did refresh a bit on them. Let's get right into it. Turkish century. My name is Connor. Did I say that? I like to learn in things. Original link to the video, top of the description. Right below that, link to the Discord. Click on it. Send you right over there. Would love to have you. Let's go.
It is often somewhat hard to deduct and find the reason for why an empire collapses. First and foremost, it is something that is, in our day and age, very easily exploited for very cheap political nonsense shots. The Roman Empire is a great example of this. I am sure
What is that? Oh, that's a good profile.
Cheap
Okay,
political
sorry.
nonsense shots. The Roman Empire is a great example of this. I am sure many of you have seen that Michael Moore movie, where he draws comparisons between the supposed decadence of the late Roman Empire and the United States, or some drooling right-wing YouTuber claiming immigration caused the Roman Empire to collapse. However, when the Roman Empire collapsed, it was at the height of Christianity's power in the empire, when most of the things we consider to be decadent had been abolished. And the Romans purposefully sought out the conquest and settling of foreign peoples who they could then use as a resource. The list of reasons for why this empire collapsed is immensely long, and many of these reasons are often overlooked by hacks who seek to make cheap political points. By the 3rd century, the wealthiest Romans had basically stopped paying taxes, which made paying large armies to patrol the borders close to impossible. There is the in a previous chapter mentioned recurve bow, the fact that the Romans offered the Goths
Hold on, what?
taxes, which made pay. By the 3rd century, the wealthiest Romans had basically stopped paying taxes, which made paying large armies to patrol the borders close to impossible. There is the in a previous chapter mentioned recurve bow, the fact that the Romans offered the Goths lands as vassals in exchange for an alliance against the Huns, and after defeating the Huns, betrayed that promise, to which the Goths reacted by pillaging Roman lands. The fact that the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius invaded and sacked the West because it tolerated non-Christians and even appointed them as senators, a war from which the West barely recovered. This leads us to one of the most overlooked reasons, the increasing fanaticism of the Roman Christian churches, which in the final century of Rome's existence persecuted non-Christians and made such incredibly wise decisions as declaring bathing, and by that extent personal hygiene, to be a satanic ritual. Gee, I wonder where all those late Roman plagues came from. In summary, there's a long list of reasons for why some nations fail, and some of these reasons are unfortunately easily abused, and others easily overlooked. History is never simple, and the reason for why historic events happen are also often never simple. When it comes to the Ottoman Empire in popular history, the moment mostly used as the supposed beginning of the decline is the failed siege of Vienna. But that is really not the moment to realistically choose. This was an extraordinary event, one of the few moments where European states that usually were enemies were able to unite in a common cause. So it makes for a nice story, something that sounds nice and appeals to visions that people may have of the past and present.
LXH. So is the video I'm watching about the Ottomans and Christians fighting each other, does that culminate in the Siege of Vienna? Because
Present as civilization.
Never mind.
Struggles between vague concepts of cultures. But it leaves out a fundamental fact, which is that even after this defeat, the Ottoman Empire was still at the peak of its strength and would remain a powerhouse for almost 2 more centuries. Let me instead posit to you 3 alternative reasons for why the Ottoman Empire declined.
Okay.
Technological, geographic, and social. The compass, the cross-staff, and the carvel. The compass helped you know where you were. The compass, the cross-staff, and the carvel. The compass helped you know where you were going, the cross staff helped you figure out where you are, and the carvel was a way to build a ship that allowed it to go faster, with more cargo, and deep into the oceans. Suddenly, those vast pits of certain doom and death turned into free highways, and those highways led to new lands, which in their turn brought something new to Europe. The potato, the tomato, and corn. These new cash crops were not as frail and vulnerable as wheat.
Also, were beans also, like, were all, like, legumes, were beans also a New World thing?
Europeans said these new cash crops were not as frail and vulnerable as wheat. The Europeans suddenly had their own bread baskets that could sustain a surplus in food, and the technological advances in deep-water navigation also impacted geography, not physically, but its usefulness. If you wanted to buy Chinese silk or Indian spices, you had to pay the tariff set by the Chinese, Mughals, Safavids, Ottomans, and Venetians. These products ended up being luxuries due to the resulting large price tag, and the Ottomans controlled that trade route, so a lot of the money went to them. Then the Portuguese simply sailed around Africa and them, cutting out all the middlemen and bringing vast fortunes.
Isn't that what Rockefeller did? And that's like how he made a lot of money in the US. Like he was kind of a pirate, like he controlled every single mode of production for oil, and so like all of the profits.
The strategic importance of the Mediterranean, which had helped the Ottomans so much, was suddenly a trap. Now they were closed in and limited by that small ocean and couldn't break out into the open ocean.
Guys!
This brings us to a battle and a war which I believe were more significant than the Siege of Vienna. For the Ottomans to break out of the Mediterranean, they would have to conquer and control the entire Mediterranean.
Guys, the downfall of the Ottoman Empire seems to be linked to exploration and sea travel. Because weren't they really powerful like 1400s, even 1500s, but like come the 1600s when it's really established trade routes, they're just on the decline.
So they went to war with Venice, the Papal States, Genoa, and Spain, and were shattered at the Battle of Lepanto, where the recently developed new naval technologies proved their worth. The massive and powerful Ottoman navy that had controlled the Mediterranean for centuries consisted of rowing galleons, meant to board enemy vessels and fight hand-to-hand. Spain sailed in with cannon-laden sailing galleons that laid waste to the outdated Ottoman navy. Ottoman dominance of the Mediterranean was thereby broken, and they were restricted to a sphere of influence around the easternmost parts of the Mediterranean.
Guys, that's so cool. That is a mind-opener.
The path to break out was through the Gulf into trying to dominate and seize control of the Indian Ocean. This resulted in a 20-year war with the Portuguese-Ethiopian alliance, which the Ottomans lost. Trapped by the limitations of their geography and technology, the Ottomans became prisoners of their own empire, unable to expand beyond its limitations. But there's also a social change which contributed to eventually undermining the Ottoman Empire. This is St. Hedwig's Cathedral in Berlin. It's just one of many cathedrals all across many European cities, but this one is somewhat special. Starting construction under Frederick II of Prussia, intent as being a temple for all religions to share as a common house of worship, it would be the first Catholic cathedral in a Protestant land. Gradually, after a few centuries of slaughtering each other over who was worshipping the right god, Europeans realized that this was silly and instead found other silly reasons to slaughter each other. But the extreme religious intolerance that had existed in prior centuries started to gradually wither away. The Ottomans thereby started losing their monopoly on tolerance. In 1774 came a massive hit to the Ottoman prestige when they were defeated by the Russians in war. The Russians annexed Ottoman lands in the Ukraine.
What happened in 1774? Is that the 7 Years' War?
On tolerance. In 1774 came a massive hit to the Ottoman prestige when they were defeated by the Russians in war. The Russians annexed Ottoman lands in the Ukraine and the Crimea, but there's an often overlooked part of this war that arguably might have done even more damage. The peace agreement included a clause that assigned and guaranteed to Russia the role of being the protector of Christians within the Ottoman Empire. And by that,
isn't that sort of what the Crimean War is about? Like a century later?
the role of being the protector of Christians within the Ottoman Empire, and by that extent, since the Ottoman Sultan was also the Caliph, Russia was the protector of Christianity in the entire Islamic world. If you were a Christian in the Ottoman Empire, you were suddenly not only able to find the same degree of condescending tolerance abroad, but you now had nations abroad that took a vested supposed interest in your well-being, who stood up for you against your overlord in case said overlord may act capriciously against you, or at least on the surface. In reality, this clause was more of a crowbar with which Russia could insert itself into Ottoman affairs as a justification for future wars.
Interesting. Yeah, Russia and Turkey, obviously Turkey. So Turkey and Sweden have some beef over terrorism or something somehow. But so could there be like another Russo-Turkish war? I definitely don't see Turkey as a pushover nation today. Like I don't see them as a weak power at all. And anyways, so okay.
Nonetheless, this started changing minds. Why should I pay more taxes, be denied equal legal protection, and live my life being constantly degraded as a heretic to a dominant faith? And the final nail in the coffin of the Ottoman social structure came from France, when the French beheaded their king, had somewhat of a revolution, and declared the emancipation of the Jews, with proclaiming that all men were equal, that all had inherent equal rights and liberties no matter their background, ethnicity, faith, or lack thereof. There is a difference between being tolerated and having rights, and with this event, the Ottoman Islamic social structures turned to many into an outdated relic of the past.
What?
The Ottoman social structure came from France, when the French beheaded their king, had somewhat of a revolution, and declared the emancipation of the Jews, with
I never heard about this. Napoleon was
proclaiming that all men were equal, that all had inherent equal rights and liberties no matter their background, ethnicity, faith, or lack thereof.
Why did I never hear about that?
There's a difference between being tolerated and having rights, and with this event, the Ottoman Islamic social structures turned to many into an outdated relic of the past.
Chapter 5. The Sick Man of Europe.
When Tsar Peter I of Russia, also known as the Great, died in 1725, he left behind a last will and testament unlike any other Tsars before him. It was meant to be shown not just to his direct successor, but to be read by each and every single Tsar or Tsarina after him the moment they ascended to the throne. It wasn't something that he had left behind for them, but a simple instruction: go and conquer Constantinople. The 1800s were a century of imperial expansion and nationalist separatism. Powerful states and ideas would equally come down on the Ottomans with intense pressure. And even though they would try to reform and revive their dying empire, they would find themselves unable to avert disaster. The ideas which the French Revolution had spawned of men as equals, a people's right to self-determination, as well as nationalism, came to be the first thing to bite the Ottomans when the Greeks rebelled during their revolution of the 1820s. Foreign interests, however, also played a role in this. The Greeks were initially losing their revolution until foreign powers saw use in a weakened Ottoman Empire and sent their fleets to help the Greeks achieve victory. This was the tipping point.
Oh, that's a cool... I'd like that as a background. I gotta wave so that when I like go back through, I can... Here, this is for me, guys, not for you. So I can take a picture.
For the first time, a people under Ottoman rule had risen in revolt against its imperial overlords and won their independence. It showed to all the others what was possible. It showed the Europeans that they could expand their influence over the Ottoman Empire by supporting separatism. It showed the Arabs that their overlords were weaker than expected and beatable. Until this moment, the Ottomans might have even still had a chance to turn things around and possibly avoid a total collapse. But from this moment on, it became unavoidable. The Greek Revolution was one of the biggest, if not the biggest nail in the Ottoman coffin. It would form the basis of a new Greek national identity, form the basis of conflict and antagonism that would last to this very day. And from the first Greek day of independence onward, the Ottomans would huddle from one disaster into another.
Quick question. What was my question? Oh, what? So they controlled, much of, the southeastern Europe, Greece, Albania, Bulgaria, Serbia area, like that area, right? So I know Albania is a kind of outlier. And that, like today, even. Well, I don't know today. That, like, they're kind of majority Muslim, even though they're not, or they have more Islam than the nations in between Albania and Turkey, and so that's a bit strange. But so, how mixed together was Greece in terms of culture? Like, were they just like a part of the Ottoman Empire that the Ottoman Empire? Like, it was a completely different culture, like, throughout the existence of the Ottoman Empire. I hope this makes sense. Let me start over. How mixed culturally and ethnically was Greece, Bulgaria? Did the Ottoman Empire assimilate them in, or were they kind of like an outside state that had its own identity but was still in the Ottoman Empire? That's my question.
Onward, the Ottomans would huddle from one disaster into another. The first to take advantage were the French, who invaded Ottoman Algeria 2 years after Greek independence and made it a colonial province of the French Empire. Also 2 years after Greek independence, the Egyptians revolted, took Jerusalem and Damascus, and gained great autonomy. The Ottomans had to get the British for help to regain control over the Levant, but the British would only do so in exchange for Cyprus.
What did you expect? What did you expect?
Both had to recognize Egyptian autonomy, marking the first time in centuries that an Arab nation asserted itself again on the world stage, with a ruler intent on modernizing and building a modern Arab monarchy. However, we don't know how that would have gone, as Britain took advantage of this fledgling little new state by occupying it, and Egypt was thereby forced into another empire.
The Egyptian leader during the Suez Crisis didn't really seem like a very, he seemed like a okay guy. Kind of just from what I learned in the, I hope there isn't like some genocide or something that I don't know about, but he seemed like I empathize with his cause. So, yeah.
Years before the end of the Greek Revolution, the Ottomans, in an attempt to clamp down and gain more control over their European lands, cracked down on the Bektashi Muslims of Albania, which resulted in a decade of continuous Albanian uprisings. In 1931, Bosnian Muslim landlords rebelled against land reform. The uprising was brutally crushed.
Guys, I missed the last 15 seconds. I'm going back.
Control over their European lands, cracked down on the Bektashi Muslims of Albania, which resulted in a decade of continuous Albanian uprisings. In 1931, Bosnian Muslim landlords rebelled against land reform. The uprising was brutally crushed, and in an attempt to solve the problem, the Ottomans split the lands up into new administrative sections, giving...
Fast forward, guys, all right? Just fast forward until I get back. I'm not missing that.
State by occupying it, and Egypt was, as Britain took advantage of this fledgling little new state by occupying, we don't with a root time in centuries that an Arab nation, a modern Arab monarchy.
Yeah,
However,
I rewinded.
We don't know
Go
how
ahead.
that would have gone, as Britain took advantage of this fledgling little new state by occupying it, and Egypt was thereby forced into another empire. 2 years before the end of the Greek Revolution, the Ottomans, in an attempt to clamp down and gain more control over their European lands, cracked down on the Bektashi Muslims of Albania, which resulted in a decade of continuous Albanian uprisings. In 1931, Bosnian Muslim landlords rebelled against land reform. The uprising was brutally crushed, and in an attempt to solve the problem, the Ottomans split the lands up into new administrative sections, giving some of it to their Serbian vassals, which created new problems that themselves kept continuously creating new problems to this day. The Serbs themselves kept having uprisings, and so did the Macedonians, the Montenegrins, the Bulgarians, and the Greeks, who were still under Ottoman rule. All this turmoil and chaos convinced outsiders that this place was falling apart and up for grabs.
This is such like a bunch of like vultures flying around, and then like looking at the dead animal like that is the Ottoman Empire, and just like one swooping in and getting a chunk and then just starting a feeding frenzy. Jeez.
It also fell into a time of greater Russian imperial ambitions under a growing nationalist pan-Slavic movement, a movement that dreamed of a greater Slavic empire, who referred to Istanbul not as Constantinople but as Tsaringrad, a future capital for such an empire, proclaiming that the turmoil was proof that the Ottomans were mistreating their Christians, and referring to the previously mentioned treaty that gave them the role as the guarantor of safety and protector of Christians in the Islamic world. The Russians invaded in 1854.
Crimean War? This is Crimean War, 100%.
During what became known as the Crimean War, and it seemed like the Ottomans were in for the next big disaster, possibly even the final one. However, the Russians may have been correct about the Ottomans falling apart, but they had gotten greedy, and with their invasion that was clearly aimed at Constantinople, they upset the European balance of powers. Those European nations may have hated each other, but they certainly didn't want a massive, overly powerful Russian empire dominating the Mediterranean and the Balkans. So in the end, the Russians accomplished something completely different, something that was almost impossible.
Another cool picture.
In the end, the Russians accomplished something completely different, something that was almost impossible the year before, an alliance between the British, the French, and the Austrians that forced the Russians out of the Balkans, and for good measure also sank the Russian fleet. But the resulting peace agreement exposed how the Ottomans' supposed allies and saviors were in reality just there to snatch bits and pieces for themselves. The British got even more concessions over Cyprus. The French gained the title of protector of Christianity in the Ottoman lands, and they would in the future themselves use it just like the Russians as a crowbar to justify war.
This channel has just the right amount of like joking. I like unbiased history of Rome, I gotta do that. But like that was like I had to like pause, like it was a lot of comedy, but this is like a perfect mixture of comedy and history and good history, and I like it.
And the Ottomans had to themselves use it just like the Russians as a crowbar to justify wars. And the Ottomans had to give up even more control over Serbia and Romania. By this time, it would take drastic measures to save the empire, which the Ottomans conducted in 1856 by abolishing the Islamic Sharia-based social order, inviting foreigners to help build a new army, restructured the state to have equal direct representation for all ethnic groups, and even built a nice modern palace in European style as they adopted European dress codes. But these changes were mainly cosmetic and didn't have much impact on changing the overall situation, as things continued mostly as usual. Next came a rebellion of Serbs in Herzegovina who had risen up against Bosnian Muslim landlords. The 1860s brought a Greek insurrection in Crete and an uprising of Arabs in Lebanon, and this was followed by the next great disaster.
Is that Bulgaria or Romania? Is that the Serbian and Russian flag? Are they?
In 1876, the Bulgarians rose up in revolt. Probably sick and tired of it all, the Ottomans made a monumentally stupid and horrible decision. Instead of just putting down the insurrections as they had done so many times before, they sent an army that raped, burnt, robbed, pillaged, slaughtered, and massacred its way through Bulgaria. In an attempt to pacify the place by terrorizing its people, tens of thousands of civilians were slaughtered. What this war is most remembered for are the mass beheadings. Every time an Ottoman army would march into a town, city, or village, all men aged 14 to 50 were gathered together in the town square and beheaded as the town was forced to watch. However, by 1876, newspapers were in wide circulation and had become part.
Holy shnikes. This is the thing
Of everyone's daily life.
Right here.
And beheaded as the town was forced
right
to
here.
watch.
Right here.
However, by 1876, newspapers were in wide circulation and
This is the thing. So what do we think of when we think of a terrible event in human history? We think of the Holocaust, right? We think of slavery, right? Well, actually, slavery was a bit further back than... I guess slavery is an exception, because we definitely are aware of the horrors of slavery. But how, like, think of all of the insane... Like, we tend to think, like, people like Hitler or Mao or Stalin are these, like, evil... I shouldn't speak for everyone, okay? I'll say me. Are like these like spawns of Satan that were just placed in the 20th century, where clearly psychotic, insane people have been around forever, but the documentation of all of the horrific stuff hasn't been recorded. And so it's kind of scary just how much this kind of stuff must have happened, and it gives an insight into how humans sort of... I don't even know what my point is. It's much harder to hide atrocities, I guess is my point.
And had become part of everyone's daily life. Most nations had by then agreed to basic sets of rules of war that forbade the intentional slaughter of civilians. French, British, German, Italians, Russian, South American, and American journalists were all over Bulgaria,
Why is German a square?
witnessing and writing about these atrocities. From one end of the world to the other, the news of what the Ottomans were doing spread, and the world united in disgust and condemnation of the Ottomans. Seeing all this, the Russians invaded, and this time nobody was going to help the Ottomans. This war, the 11th Russo-Turkish War, was an even bigger disaster for the Ottomans than the independence of Greece and all its previous military defeats. In the previous years, the Ottomans had tried to modernize their army, British and American rifles, German artillery, and British ironclad ships. But the Ottomans had not trained their army on how to use modern equipment and still relied on 200-year-old outdated defensive military tactics. They just hunkered down in trenches, hoping the Russians would do suicidal 17th century bayonet charges. Instead, the Russians shelled them into oblivion with modern artillery. The invading Russian army was also welcomed as liberators by the Bulgarians, Romanians, Armenians, and Serbs. The British and French only intervened and stopped the Russians when they were only a few miles away from Istanbul. In the resulting peace treaty, the Russians annexed the last remaining Ottoman lands in the northern Caucasus and East Armenia. Romania declared full independence and became a Russian ally. Montenegro declared independence. Serbia doubled in size, declared full independence, and became a Russian ally. Bulgaria officially became an autonomous state in the Ottoman Empire, but unofficially was independent and allied with Russia. A mass exodus of Muslims fled these new states in what became one of the world's first recorded refugee crises. In total, 1.5 million who swamped the cities of the empire in slums and squalor. The modernized Ottoman Balkan army had been wiped out. The Ottoman buffer between it and Russia was gone. In any future war, the Russians could now just march right up to Istanbul. And it has also started something else. The Armenians had welcomed the invading Russians in eastern Armenia as liberators, and Western Armenia was still in the Ottoman Empire. The Russians now declared themselves to be the protectors of the Armenians in that empire. The Ottomans now looked with ever-deepening suspicions on them.
This is a good time for Russia, huh?
Something started happening that would, a few decades down the road, lead to one of the worst crimes of the century. However, the end of that war gave the Ottomans also a brief respite. And it came through another series of events that started during that war, something unexpected that must have seemed almost comedic at the time. During the war, when the Serbs marched south and doubled their land in size, they invaded Greece. The Austrians threatened them into getting out of Greece, but the Serbs started something else with that. The Ottomans still controlled vast patches, but the Serbs started something else.
Remove gyros or gyros or gyros. They're delicious. I love them.
With that. The Ottomans still controlled vast patches of Balkan lands, but in these lands, intoxicated by nationalist delusions of grandeur and even race, Serb, Greek, Bulgarian, and Albanian nationalists started killing each other before the Ottomans were even gone, so they could have more for themselves once those Ottomans were actually gone. For centuries, these people had lived together in peace and harmony, but with the idea of separation also came the need for new ideas, justifications, and fictions around which to unite a new nation around. In that climate, what separated people became more important than what they had in common. And what...
Damn.
differentiated people often was arbitrary. Bosnians are not Turks, but Slavs who converted to Islam centuries ago. So are they Serbs of different faith, as some Serb nationalists...
I'd never understood this. Why is it whenever there's a Slavic person, they're always wearing an Adidas black jump coat? Or, like, fleece. Oh, they're Slavic? Just put one of those.
to Islam centuries ago. So are they Serbs of different faith?
It's like the cowboy hat of the... Never mind.
As Slavs who converted to Islam centuries ago. So are they Serbs of different faith, as some Serb nationalists claim? Or are they foreign invaders, as other Serb nationalists claim? Or something else entirely? Are Slavs that migrated to northern Macedonia Greeks? Are Orthodox Bulgarians Greeks? Who gets what cultural heritage? Should all Slavs be in one state? Should Greece have what it claims to have had 1,000 years ago? As the Ottoman Empire collapsed in the Balkans, the newly emergent entities started engaging each other in hostility.
That's so fascinating. This is my favorite part, learning about history, bar none. It is my favorite. When it connects, it... You guys know what I mean by fog of war, okay? Like, my fog of war in history is the places where, like, things aren't connected yet. And, like, it has to be... It's moments like this where I'm like, oh, that's why the... Like, wait, so the Balkans are always at each other's throats, the countries. Why is that? And it just... I love how all history is tied together. It's like a giant, beautiful story, and it actually happened, and I love it.
Serbs against Greeks, against Bulgarians and vice versa, over who the people in the remaining lands were and should be part of. 30 years before the Ottomans had even left those lands. These fights were the forerunners of wars soon to come, but also the harbinger of greater catastrophes to befall the Balkans in the closing years of the 20th century. During the war with Russia, the other European powers met at a conference in Berlin where they divided Africa up amongst themselves, but also secretly divided up the remaining Ottoman lands in Africa without even telling them. The British made Cyprus a full protectorate and occupied Egypt, which was The British made Cyprus a full protectorate and occupied Egypt, which was technically still an Ottoman protectorate. The French invaded Tunisia and made it part of their empire. The Ottomans were furious, but there was little to nothing they could do.
What you gonna do about it, bro? Oh, they're like a...
period of only 70 years, but there was little to nothing they could do. Within a time period of only 70 years, the once mightiest empire of the hemisphere had shrunken down to a fifth of its former size. A quarter of its population was still Christian, but it had lost almost all it had in Europe.
So who's in control of this area? You know, of most of Saudi Arabia, what is that, Oman or Yemen? Qatar, UAE. I'd imagine just kind of a lot of deserty area that's hard to control, and so probably controlled by a bunch of Arab tribes, Muslim tribes.
Besides northern Macedonia, northern Greece, it had lost almost all it had in Europe besides northern Macedonia, northern Greece, Rumelia, and Crete. All its African vassals were gone, with the exception of Libya, which was basically just a scrap of sand and not worth that much. The Caucasus had slipped away into the hands of Russia, who were by now their biggest threat and right at their doorstep.
On both sides.
The Mediterranean was now mostly under British control, and in the remaining Arab lands, the empire had lost much of its legitimacy as an Islamic spiritual leader, as the Arabs increasingly turned away to seek new leaders and solutions.
Allah?
In this mess, a group of idealistic young men would lash out in an attempt to save what was left, but in the end, would only bring upon themselves the end of the empire.
Is that... Hey, I was right, the Young Turks. Alright, guys. Got chapters 4 and 5 done there. Emerald Lane. I hope you're all doing well. That was really awesome. And I'll continue this. Don't worry, I won't show up 4 months later with the next episode. I will continue this in the next few days. Hope you're all doing well. Chin up if you're not. You'll be good soon. Don't worry. Emotions are fickle. Bye, guys.